The courtroom was filled with people, their eyes moving between the two parents sitting on opposite sides of the room. The air was thick with tension as the judge, an older man with a serious face, listened carefully to the lawyers arguing back and forth. This was not just any case. It was a fierce custody battle over an 8-year-old boy named Ethan. Ethan sat quietly on a wooden bench next to his court-appointed guardian, a woman who was there to make sure his best interests were considered. He was small for his age, with wide, observant eyes. His hands rested in his lap, and though he didn't say a word, his mind was racing. He had been in this courtroom before. He had heard the same arguments before, and he hated every second of it. On one side of the courtroom, Ethan's mother sat with her lawyer, her hands clenched into fists. She had tears in her eyes but tried to hide them. Her lawyer was speaking in a firm voice, arguing that Ethan's father was not responsible enough to take care of him. She claimed he missed important events, forgot school meetings, and didn't provide a stable home for their son. On the other side, Ethan's father shook his head, frustration clear on his face. His lawyer was just as determined, arguing that the mother was too strict, too controlling, and made decisions without considering what was best for Ethan. The words flew back and forth like a game of tug-of-war, but Ethan was the one being pulled in both directions. The judge listened patiently, but his expression remained unreadable. He had seen many cases like this before. Parents fighting, blaming each other, trying to prove who was the better one. He knew that in the middle of it all was always a child, too young to understand why the people he loved the most were tearing each other apart. As the arguments continued, Ethan's eyes darted around the room. He noticed the people in the audience whispering, shaking their heads. Some were strangers, some were family members who had taken sides. He saw his grandmother in the back, looking sad. He saw his uncle crossing his arms, watching angrily. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone thought they knew what was best, but no one had asked him. The voices grew louder. Ethan's mother was now speaking directly, her voice breaking as she begged the judge to listen to her. His father's lawyer interrupted, stating facts about how much time Ethan had spent with his father and how happy he had been. The judge raised a hand to quiet them, glancing at Ethan for a moment. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew what was coming. The judge was going to make a decision, one that would change his life. Would he have to pack his bags and move away? Would he have to say goodbye to one of his parents forever? He didn't want to choose. He loved them both, even if they didn't seem to love each other anymore. He looked down at his hands, his fingers curled into small fists. He had spent months feeling invisible, watching adults talk about him as if he weren't there. But he was there. He had thoughts. He had feelings. And for the first time, he realized something. He didn't have to stay silent. Before he could think twice, Ethan took a deep breath, stood up, and stepped forward. His guardian gasped and reached for his arm, but he gently pulled away. He walked toward the judge, his small feet making soft sounds against the floor. The whole courtroom fell silent. His mother's eyes widened. His father leaned forward. Ethan took another breath, his heart racing, and then he spoke. "Would you like me to continue expanding the rest of the parts in a similar style?" The judge's eyes locked onto Ethan, surprised by his sudden movement. The entire courtroom was silent. No one expected an 8-year-old boy to stand up in the middle of such an important case. His mother looked shocked, her lips slightly parted. His father leaned forward, his hands gripping the table. The lawyers, who had been speaking nonstop for the past hour, finally stopped. Every person in the room now had their eyes on the small boy standing in front of the judge's bench. Ethan's heart was pounding so hard, he thought everyone could hear it. His legs felt shaky, but he stood tall. He had never spoken in a courtroom before. He had never interrupted adults when they were talking. But today, he knew he had to. He couldn't sit and listen any longer while decisions were made about his life without him having a say. The judge, a serious-looking man with gray hair and sharp eyes, studied Ethan carefully. He wasn't used to children speaking up in his courtroom. Most of the time, Kids were too scared or too confused to say anything. But Ethan looked different. His face was determined, his small hands clenched at his sides. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward. "Ethan," he said in a calm voice, "is there something you'd like to say?" Ethan swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak. "Yes," he said softly, then took a deep breath. "I want to talk." The judge nodded. "Go ahead." Ethan's mother shifted in her seat. She looked nervous. His father's lawyer frowned, as if unsure whether this was a good idea. Ethan's guardian, the woman sitting beside him earlier, looked at the judge, waiting to see if he would allow this. Ethan turned his head slightly and saw his mother wiping her eyes. His father looked at him with concern. He knew they both loved him, but they had spent so much time fighting each other that they had forgotten to ask what he wanted. That wasn't fair. He took another deep breath and looked straight at the judge. "Why hasn't anyone asked me what I want?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it was strong enough to make everyone hear. A hushed murmur spread across the courtroom. The judge raised a hand to quiet the whispers. He kept his eyes on Ethan, thinking carefully before he spoke. "You're right," he said finally. "No one has asked you. But I'm asking now. What do you want, Ethan?" Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, it was harder than he thought. He looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He didn't want to hurt his mom. He didn't want to disappoint his dad. But he also didn't want to live in a world where he had to choose between them. "I don't want to pick between my parents," he said honestly. "I love them both." His mother let out a small sob. His father exhaled deeply. The tension in the room shifted. The arguments, the shouting, the legal battles, it all felt so small compared to Ethan's simple words. The judge tapped his fingers against the wooden bench, deep in thought. "That's a fair answer," he said. "But I need to understand something. Are you happy with the way things are now?" Ethan shook his head. "No," he admitted. "They don't talk to each other. They only talk in court, and when they do, they fight. They don't see how hard this is for me." He blinked quickly, trying to keep his tears from falling. "I just want my family to stop fighting. I want to feel like I belong with both of them, not just one." The room was silent again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This time, it felt heavy. It felt real. Even the lawyers, who had been arguing so passionately before, now looked uncertain. The judge looked around the courtroom. He had been handling cases for years, but this was different. This wasn't about legal terms or paperwork. This was about a child who had been caught in the middle for too long. He let out a slow breath. "Thank you for telling me how you feel, Ethan," he said gently. "I promise you, I will take your words seriously." Ethan nodded. He had done what he needed to do. Now he could only hope that the adults in the room would finally listen. The courtroom remained silent, but something had changed. It was no longer just about the legal arguments or the parents trying to prove who was right. Now the most important voice in the room belonged to an 8-year-old boy. Ethan had spoken, and his words hung in the air, making everyone rethink what they had been fighting over. His mother wiped her tears quickly, glancing at Ethan with a mixture of sadness and regret. His father looked down at the table, his jaw tightening. Neither of them had expected their son to speak up like this. They had spent so much time arguing about what was best for him, but they had never stopped to listen to him. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the wooden bench. His eyes remained on Ethan, studying him carefully. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had said what he wanted to say, but he didn't know if it would change anything. The judge finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Ethan, I understand that you don't want to choose between your parents," he said. "That's a difficult position for any child to be in. But the reason we are here today is because your parents can't seem to agree on what's best for you. I need to make a decision that ensures your happiness and well-being." Ethan took a deep breath. He knew that was true. His parents had been fighting for months, and neither of them wanted to compromise. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. He looked at the judge with determined eyes. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Of course." Ethan hesitated for only a second before speaking. What if they stopped fighting? A few quiet gasps echoed in the courtroom. His mother and father both looked up sharply, as if they hadn't heard him correctly. Even the lawyers exchanged glances. It was the one thing no one had considered. The judge sighed. "That would be ideal, Ethan," he admitted. "But your parents have tried to reach an agreement, and unfortunately, they haven't been able to." Ethan turned toward his parents, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "But have they really tried?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes shone with emotion. "Or have they only tried to win?" His mother's breath hitched. His father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ethan could tell his words had struck something deep within them. They didn't look angry anymore. They looked ashamed. He took a step closer. "I don't care about money. I don't care about rules or schedules," he continued. "I care about my family. I don't want to live in two separate worlds where I feel like I have to choose one over the other. I want parents who talk to each other, not just in a courtroom but at home. For me." A thick silence followed his words. The judge watched the parents carefully, his expression unreadable. He had seen plenty of custody cases, but rarely had he seen a child fight so hard to bring his family together, instead of being forced to pick a side. Ethan turned back to the judge. "If you give them another chance, I know they can do better," he said confidently. "They just forgot how to work together. But I haven't forgotten what it's like when they do." His mother let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hand. His father closed his eyes for a moment, then looked up at Ethan with an expression he had never seen before, one of deep regret. The judge folded his hands together, considering Ethan's words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You've given me a lot to think about, Ethan," he said. "And I believe your parents have something to think about too." The decision was no longer just in the hands of the judge. Now, it was up to Ethan's parents to decide if they would listen, not just to the court, but to their son. The entire courtroom seemed frozen in time. Ethan's words had changed something. His parents were no longer focused on winning against each other. Instead, they were looking at their son, their little boy who had spoken with more wisdom than either of them had shown in months. The judge let the silence linger for a moment before finally clearing his throat. "Ethan," he said, his voice steady, "you just asked something very important. You asked if your parents could stop fighting. But the question is, are they willing to?" Ethan's mother shifted in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears. His father let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, they weren't looking at their lawyers. They weren't focused on the arguments. They were focused on each other, and more importantly, on Ethan. The judge turned to them. "I think we should hear from both of you," he said. "Your son has spoken honestly. Now, I want to know what you have to say." Ethan's mother was the first to respond. She placed a trembling hand over her heart and looked at her son. "Ethan, I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "I thought I was fighting for you. I thought I was doing what was best." She took a shaky breath. "But I see now that I've been so focused on proving I was right that I never stopped to ask what you needed." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had waited so long to hear those words. He looked at his father, who was still staring at the table, his hands clasped tightly together. Ethan's heart pounded as he waited. Finally, his father lifted his head. His eyes were filled with emotions Ethan had never seen before: regret, sadness, and something else: understanding. "Ethan," he said slowly, "I don't know if I can fix everything overnight, but I do know one thing. I never want to make you feel like you have to choose between us." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His father continued, his voice quiet but firm. "Your mom and I, we lost sight of what really matters. I don't know how we got here. but I know this isn't the way it's supposed to be." He turned toward Ethan's mother, really looking at her for the first time in what felt like forever. "We used to be a team, remember?" His mother gave a small nod, wiping her eyes. "Yes, we did." The judge watched them carefully before speaking. "It sounds to me like you both agree on something for the first time in a long while," he said. "But words are not enough. If you truly want to put Ethan first, you need to show him." Ethan's parents exchanged a long look. For months, they had only seen each other as enemies. But now, in this quiet moment, they saw something else. The person they had once worked with, once cared for, and most importantly, the other half of Ethan's world. The judge leaned forward slightly. Ethan asked for something simple. He wants his parents to stop fighting. Can you do that? His mother looked at his father. His father looked back at her. Then, after a long moment, his father gave a slow nod. Yes. His mother sniffled and nodded too. Yes, we can. Ethan felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Real hope. Not just the kind he wished for when he blew out birthday candles or when he saw a shooting star. This was different. This was real. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench and let out a deep breath. Then let's talk about how we make that happen. Ethan's heart swelled. For the first time, this wasn't just about a court decision. This was about his family finding a way back to each other. And for him, that meant everything. The air in the courtroom felt different now. It was no longer filled with anger and blame. Instead, there was something softer, something that had been missing for a long time. Hope. Ethan sat back down, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had spoken up, and for the first time, his parents had truly listened. They weren't looking at him like a prize to be won. They were looking at him like their son, someone they both loved more than anything in the world. The judge let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers on the bench. He had seen many cases where families were torn apart by arguments, but this was different. Ethan had reminded his parents of something important, that their fight wasn't just about legal rights or custody papers. It was about a little boy who wanted his family back. "All right," the judge said, his voice steady. "You've both said you want to do better for Ethan, but now, I need to see action. Words are a good start, but they mean nothing if you don't follow through." Ethan's mother straightened in her chair, nodding. "I understand." His father cleared his throat and sat up as well. "I do too." The judge glanced at Ethan, then back at his parents. "Here's what I'm going to do," he continued. "I will not make a final custody ruling today." A few quiet gasps came from the audience. Even the lawyers looked surprised. The judge held up a hand. "Instead, I'm giving you both a chance to prove that you can work together as co-parents, a chance to show Ethan that you can put him first, not just in words, but in actions." Ethan's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. He thought the judge would choose one parent or make a strict decision about where he would live. But this was different. His mother bit her lip. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked carefully. The judge leaned forward. "It means that for the next 3 months, I want to see real cooperation between the two of you. No more fighting in front of Ethan. No more using lawyers to speak for you. No more treating each other like enemies. You will share time with Ethan equally. And most importantly, you will communicate directly, respectfully, and without hostility." Ethan's father exhaled. "And if we fail?" The judge's expression turned serious. "Then I will be forced to make a final decision, one that may not be what either of you want." Silence filled the room. It was a challenge, and Ethan's parents knew it. Could they really do it? Could they let go of their anger and work together? Ethan looked between them, his heart hammering. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. His parents had spent so much time arguing that it felt like all they knew how to do anymore. But deep down, he believed in them. He believed they could change, not just for themselves, but for him. His mother turned to his father. "Can we do this?" she asked, her voice quiet but hopeful. His father hesitated for a moment, then met her gaze. "We have to," he said simply. The judge gave a firm nod. "Then it's settled. We will meet again in 3 months to review your progress. Until then, Ethan deserves to see both of his parents treating each other with respect." Ethan felt something warm spread in his chest. For the first time in a long time, it felt like his family had been given a second chance, and he was going to hold on to that hope with everything he had. The next few weeks were different from anything Ethan had experienced in a long time. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. For the first time since the divorce, his parents were actually trying. At first, things were awkward. His mom and dad were used to arguing, not working together. They didn't know how to talk without bringing up old fights, but they remembered the judge's warning, and more importantly, they remembered Ethan's words. One of the biggest changes happened right away: communication. Instead of talking through lawyers or sending short, tense messages, his parents had to speak to each other directly. It started with small things like discussing his school schedule or deciding who would pick him up from soccer practice. But soon, something surprising happened. They began having real conversations. One evening, Ethan sat on the couch at his mom's house, pretending to read a book while secretly listening to his parents talk on the phone. "I think Ethan's been doing really well in school," his mom said. "His teacher mentioned he's been more focused lately." "That's great to hear," his dad responded. "I've noticed he seems happier too. I think having more stability is helping him." Ethan smiled to himself. This was what he had wanted all along, not just time with both parents, but a sense of peace. Another big change was how they handled their time with him. Before, every exchange had felt like a battle. His parents had treated their time with him like a competition, always worried about getting more hours or proving they were the better parent. But now, they were finally sharing time without turning it into a fight. One weekend, instead of arguing over who got to take Ethan to the park, they decided to go together. It was strange at first. Ethan had never seen his parents in the same place without tension hanging between them. But as they walked through the park, something shifted. His dad pushed him on the swings while his mom cheered him on. They even sat together on a bench, talking while Ethan played. Ethan kept glancing at them, expecting one of them to suddenly get upset or walk away. But they didn't. They stayed. The biggest test came when a small disagreement happened. Ethan had a school project due, and both parents wanted to help. His mom thought it would be best if he worked on it at her house, while his dad wanted to be involved too. A few months ago, this would have turned into a shouting match. But this time, they handled it differently. "How about we split the work?" his dad suggested. "He can start it at your place, and then I'll help him finish." His mom hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "That sounds fair." Ethan stared at them in disbelief. No yelling, no blaming, just a simple agreement. As the weeks went on, Ethan felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He no longer had to worry about being caught in the middle of their fights. He didn't have to pick sides. He could just be a kid again. One night, as his mom tucked him into bed, he looked up at her. "Do you think you and Dad will ever be friends again?" he asked. She paused, brushing his hair back gently. "I don't know, sweetheart," she admitted. "But what I do know is that we are both trying, and that's because of you." Ethan smiled, feeling warmth fill his heart. He didn't need everything to be perfect. He just needed his parents to keep trying. And for the first time in a long time, he believed they would. As the weeks passed, Ethan began to notice even more changes in his parents. They weren't just trying for him anymore. They were learning to work together in a way they hadn't in years. One afternoon, Ethan's soccer team had a big game. In the past, his parents had either avoided sitting near each other or made the entire event feel tense with their awkwardness. But this time, something was different. Ethan spotted his mom and dad standing together near the bleachers, talking like normal people instead of enemies. His mom pointed at something on her phone, and his dad nodded. actually listening. When the game started, they sat near each other, both cheering for him, instead of acting like they were in separate worlds. Ethan played his best game that day, scoring 2 goals. As soon as the whistle blew, he ran toward the sidelines. To his surprise, both of his parents were standing there waiting for him. "You were amazing out there, buddy," his dad said, patting his back. His mom nodded, smiling proudly. "We're so proud of you." Ethan beamed. "Thanks." Then he hesitated for a second before asking, "Can we all go out for ice cream?" His parents exchanged a glance. In the past, this simple request would have caused an argument. They would have fought over whose time it was or who should take him. But today, they both just smiled. "Sounds like a great idea," his mom said. His dad agreed. "Let's go." Ethan couldn't believe it. For the first time in years, they were going somewhere together, not as a couple, but as his parents. And that was enough. The next test came when Ethan got sick. It started with a mild fever, but by the next morning, he felt terrible. Normally, this would have caused stress. His parents would have argued about who should take care of him, making everything harder than it needed to be. But this time, something unexpected happened. His mom called his dad, not to argue, but to work together. "His fever is still high," she said. "Would you mind picking up some medicine on your way over?" Of course, his dad answered immediately. "I'll be there soon." When his dad arrived, he didn't just drop off the medicine and leave. He stayed. Together, his parents made sure Ethan was comfortable, taking turns checking his temperature and making sure he had everything he needed. At one point, Ethan woke up to see both of them sitting by his bed, talking in quiet voices. They weren't arguing. They weren't blaming each other. They were just 2 parents who cared about their son. Ethan's heart swelled. He didn't need them to be best friends. He didn't need them to be together again. He just needed them to be there. A few days later, Ethan was feeling much better. As he sat on the couch, his parents stood nearby, talking about his upcoming parent-teacher meeting. "I can go this time," his dad said. His mom nodded. "That works. Just let me know what the teacher says." Ethan watched them, realizing how far they had come. A few months ago, they wouldn't have been able to have this conversation without turning it into a fight. Now, they were figuring things out together. He took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The judge had given them 3 months to prove they could change, and they were doing it. Not perfectly, not easily, but they were trying. And for Ethan, that meant everything. The 3 months had passed faster than Ethan had expected, and now they were back in the courtroom. The same judge sat before them, looking at his parents with sharp but kind eyes. This time, the air in the room felt different. There was no tension, no anger, only quiet understanding. Ethan sat between his parents, just like before, but something had changed. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't afraid of what would happen. He knew, deep in his heart, that today would be different. The judge folded his hands and looked at Ethan's parents. "Well," he said, "it's been 3 months. I gave you both a chance to prove that you could put your son first. Now tell me, what has changed?" Ethan's mother was the first to speak. She straightened her back and took a deep breath. "A lot has changed, Your Honor," she said. "At first, it wasn't easy. We had to learn how to talk to each other without fighting. We had to remind ourselves that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about Ethan." She glanced at her son, a soft smile on her lips. "And when we started focusing on what was best for him, everything became clearer." His father nodded in agreement. "I won't lie and say we never disagreed," he admitted. "But we learned to handle things differently. We started communicating, working as a team instead of opponents. And honestly, it's made all the difference." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And how do you feel about all this, Ethan?" he asked, turning his attention to the boy. Ethan felt all eyes on him, but this time he wasn't afraid. He sat up straight and spoke clearly. "I feel happy," he said simply. "Before, I always felt like I had to choose between my mom and dad, like I was stuck in the middle of a fight that would never end. But now I feel like I have both of them, not just on paper, but in real life." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "That is exactly what I hoped to hear." He tapped his fingers on the desk, then looked at Ethan's parents again. "You two have done something many parents fail to do. You put aside your differences and put your son first. And because of that, I see no reason to change your custody arrangement." Ethan's heart soared. His parents smiled at each other, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't a forced or polite smile. It was real. The judge continued, his tone serious but kind. "This doesn't mean your journey is over. Co-parenting is a lifelong commitment. There will be disagreements. There will be tough days. But if you both remember why you're doing this, for him, I have no doubt that you will continue to succeed." Ethan's mother wiped a tear from her eye and nodded. His father reached over and gave Ethan's shoulder a gentle squeeze. The judge gave one last look at them before speaking again. "Court is adjourned." And just like that, it was over. But for Ethan, it felt like a new beginning. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Ethan looked up at his parents. "So, can we get lunch together?" he asked hopefully. His parents exchanged a glance, then nodded. "Absolutely," his mom said. "Sounds like a great idea," his dad added. Ethan grinned. Months ago, this moment would have seemed impossible. But now, he knew, his parents were not just saying they had changed. They had shown it. And as they walked toward the car, side by side, Ethan knew that no matter what happened in the future, his family was finally on the right path.